Today's session deals with assessing information needs. Whenever you start a project, one of the most important steps is to be able to assess your needs and to be able to clearly define them and put them in the context that will be important in how you plan your project. In today's session, we're going to look at assessing information needs from 4 perspectives that we hope will help you to put together the ideas you need for your strategic management plan. Those 4 pieces are, in our first session, orientation to the process. And we're going to look at some success factors that really are important in just what you ought to consider when you begin to assess your own information needs. In the second part of it, we're going to be talking about an operational model. Barry Prokop, who's joining me today again as co-host from Fairfax County Public Schools, and I spent the better part of 2 years together in developing an operational model for the Division of Personnel Services. And in doing that, we learned a number of things that we feel will really be important to you, and so we're going to cover those pieces. In the third part, we have Greg Cook, the instructional technology specialist from Tidewater Community College, who's had a lot of experience in this whole field and is also in the midst right now of assessing information needs for his own school. And we'll be looking forward to seeing him as we move into that part of it. In the last section, we're going to be talking about some of the principles that are really important in how one puts together strategic planning. And we're going to pull from all of the things that we learned in the first 3 parts of today's lesson. And now we're going to start. And again, let's look at what does it take, Barry, to be successful in assessing information needs, no matter where you are and no matter what kind of project that you're working on.
There are a number of points that you need to consider when you're going to assess how successful you're going to be. The first thing you really need to do when you go into any type of project is to make sure that you understand the organization that you're dealing with. And this is very critical, especially if you're dealing with education or engineering companies or communication companies or any other kind of company. You have to understand, what makes that company work, what is making it successful, what kind of markets it's in, what kind of competitors that are involved in that, and what type of organization that company has. Is it a hierarchical organization, or is it a horizontal or a flatter organization?
Also, another problem in today's market is that the whole concept of where an office is, it has changed. An office may be a whole accumulation of offices, all located in different buildings, for example, but feeding into a central function, such as we learned about in the horizontal organization.
Well, some of the problems that a company encounters may be very different in an organization that only is isolated in one building, or an organization that has multiple buildings throughout the state, the country, or the world. Even though the problem may be the same, understanding how those different buildings interrelate are critical to your success.
One of the problems that we're having in today's office environment, and this is in education or in business or industry, is what we call the changing role of staff and managers. We used to think that if you worked in an office and you had a job, that you would stay with that job and you'd be classified according to a certain position, and you would be there for a while and maybe you would move up or do something else. But people knew what you did and they knew your function. In today's multi-office environment, that seems to be changing because at one time on one project you could have one role, and at another time you could have a clearly different role, and all those roles have to be taken into consideration according to the project that you're working on.
Well, and it's not only the different projects that you're working on that differentiate the worker in the 90s. It's actually what we talked about a little bit before, about the changing nature of their jobs because of the impact of technology. And what the worker did in a, let's say, payroll operation 10 years ago is vastly different than what that payroll worker does today. And I'm not talking about the specific job, because they still pay people, right, but I'm talking about how they actually do that job is vastly different.
We're talking here about the cultural differences. Is that right? And how they change?
In part. One of the important items to consider, and one of the parts that people probably fail to notice most when they go in and assess needs is the actual culture of the organization. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into an organization and looked at a problem and organized a solution only to have it fail because the culture of that organization, I did not take that into account when I developed the solution. And the culture in any organization does impact how that organization runs.
Well, if you go in and try to do a plan for an office in which the people have operated in an extremely hierarchical way for years, and that's the only thing they've ever known, and you bring in a new automated environment, this really grand new network in which everybody has access basically to the same kind of information, and they're expected to share it, that they will not have developed the kinds of skills or competencies necessary to work in that new environment.
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about, the culture of that organization. And basically, I guess it translates into their willingness at risk. In other words, are they willing to go in and make a radical change to improve productivity, or do you have to apply that change incrementally over time for that change to take place? And it all is really included in how that organization thinks and how they've done things historically and how rapidly they want to move forward in terms of technology and how ready they are to do that.
If you don't have the necessary management infrastructure in place to carry out what you want to do, then it's not going to work, is it? All this new technology would have a tendency to fail if it's not within that overall context.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's really a whole combination of events. You know, we just talked about the organization. You have to understand the organization itself. You know, how it's run, the people that are involved, the infrastructure, the distribution of the labor, etc. We've talked about the culture, but the willingness to accept technology is also a key point because it allows an organization to move forward and be more efficient. And it's really a tool that people use to be able to do that. And some companies that have had no exposure to technology at all, you know, are a little bit more shy about bringing in technology than ones that have used it in other environments or used it for other processes.
I guess the attitudes and values that the organization has, which feeds into the culture, really also have to be modified if you're bringing in a totally new system to accomplish new purposes.
Of anything that we talk about today, it's really the culture that people have to gear themselves to changing for anything to be successful. You can have the greatest solution in the world. You can identify all the problems in the world. You could have the greatest technology in the world. But if the culture doesn't allow you to implement those changes, then you're really going to have a problem in being successful with that needs assessment.
I did some consulting work for an organization and was asked to basically automate one piece of their work environment that had been handled manually or semi-manually for years. And I simply talked to the people, and I was told by the manager, go in and just put in the graphic function, combine this with a spreadsheet function, tie this into the word processor, and give me the solution, and then we'll take care of the rest of it. It didn't work. It didn't work because they, nor I, never took the time to include the people who were with me, to bring them along and to help change their attitude toward what it is they were going to do. And so all they did was drag their heels, and I'm sure eventually it worked, but they might even have had to eliminate the people who were there. It all could have been eliminated had we initially understood what that culture was about to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think one of the things that I most hear when I go into organizations, when I ask people, you know, why are you doing something this way? You can probably guess that their most popular answer is that that's the way we've always done it. And they probably would be content on doing it that way on into the future. And change in any organization comes slowly, but you have to prepare the people in that organization for any change. You can't just go in and say, do this, do this, do this, do this, and it'll be better. Because if people don't understand why you're doing something or what the end result is that you're trying to achieve, they're not going to really see any purpose in it or have any investment in it.
I wonder how difficult it is when you go into an organization today and tell the top manager, if you're a consultant or you're in there as the change agent, and you say, in addition to all the technology that we're going to provide for you, you're also going to have to spend quite a bit of time in changing the attitudes and values and orientation of your infrastructure with all your people, or you're not going to be very successful. The answer is very simple in some cases. We don't really have time for that. Just tell us what to do and we'll make it all work. And I don't know any studies that show what the failure rate in that particular case is. I think eventually people just adjust. But I wonder the kind of toll it takes on people doesn't really need to be there. And a very simple understanding of how you have to modify how people feel about what they're doing and how you include them as part of the decision and as part of the assessment of needs as you move into it will make all the difference in the world on how quickly you can do it, how willing the people in the organization will be to accept the changes as you move into it. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that with all this technological glitter that we can put online quickly and efficiently, that will really allow people to do a better job. I think it sometimes does, but sometimes it does it at the cost of people, and that's really what we're talking about here, aren't we, when we're talking about understanding the culture. Barry, what about how ready an organization really needs to be to make this all work successfully? You've had a lot of experience in dealing and trying to make people ready as you move on new solutions, and I know that in your problem solution model developed for Fairfax, readiness was always a critical question. What about in all organizations? How important is that concept as you see it?
It really can come in two different flavors. Okay. There can be the organizations that have nothing, and you start out slow implementing technology and then get to a critical mass or a place where it gets to be productive. Or you just throw in technology, lots of technology in up front. The whole key that is going to glue all this together, though, is the training and the communication that you provide those people through that whole process as to how much technology or how many innovative changes you can introduce into an organization for your plan to be successful. If you have a lot of investment or put a lot of investment in the training and the communication throughout the process, then I think probably either one will work. Now, companies that already have technology in place are pretty much a little bit ahead of the game because they know what to expect. They know the thinking still out there somewhat is if I introduce technology, we're going to lose jobs out of all this thing. So there's still a little bit of fear factor when you interject a lot of technology into an organization. And I think you and I both found that when you interject technology into an organization, you don't lose jobs. Your roles just change within that organization.
Actually, you find yourself doing more than you did before. And the more ready you make your organization in which you're working to accept these changes and to accept the changes on a very specific schedule, which is another point in readiness I think we need to talk about here. I've always been a believer that you can make an organization ready by laying out all of the key steps that you intend to take in your implementation plan, and you let everybody see it. You can make an organization ready if you tell everybody what it is you're about. If you try to hide something, then you really decrease the capacity of your organization to really function effectively as it moves into new technology.
Well, no one likes to be surprised. Everyone likes to know exactly what's going on in the organization and where you're heading. So I think exactly what you said is true. If you let people know what's around the corner, then I think that you're going to get there a lot more rapidly and with a lot more willingness on the part of the employees because they know what they have to prepare for down the road. They know that in 5 years they're going to have a local area network in there. They know within 5 years that they're going to be on system-wide email and on internet, etc. And they have the opportunity to prepare, to do their own self-education and to get training on the job, etc.
I worked in one organization, Barry, where the manager insisted that everything that was developed in the plan, the strategic plan, be placed into a three-ring binder, and that every single member of the organization that had anything to do with the operation be given a copy of that. And it had a sort of a statement up front and said, look, this thing is going to change, but this will give you an idea where we are and how we intend to do it. If you have any suggestions, please let us know at any point, not only now, but at any point in our planning process. That plan was rather successful, I felt.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it, because you had all levels of the organization involved in making that plan or contributing to the plan. Maybe not every part of it was accepted, but at least they had their opinion shown or recorded, and you were able to take that into account when you made your decisions.
Well, don't you think that the reason that there was so much success in the Fairfax County model that we're going to show them was that everybody in the organization knew precisely what was going to happen, and that they also participated in it, and they also knew basically when it was going to occur, because we worked cooperatively with them to work out a schedule of implementation.
Well, yes, and also another key point, we had top-level commitment. When you went into to Fairfax County, into the Department of Personnel Services, it was widely known that the head of personnel was deeply invested in the project. And that is also another critical success factor, getting top-level commitment. Because you and I have both been in situations where we go in and the top level is basically invisible, and we go in and do a study and then come out of it, and no one in the organization really felt that the study was important. They felt it was another binder to be put on the shelf, because no one in the organization really said, this is important to us. You will cooperate, you will provide us with the information we need to make it successful.
One time I worked in an organization in which the top manager alone made a decision to automate, and it was at that time, the whole word processing environment. And to do it using a certain piece of software which they had for years. And I remember sitting with the manager's CEO, and he said, I want to do this, and this is the way it's going to be done, and your job is to tell me how to do it. And my first question to him was, well, how do you know that what you're currently doing isn't working? And he said, well, you're a consultant. You just do what I tell you to do, and it will all work. Now, I think in that case it had the top level commitment, but it didn't have anybody else's commitment in the organization. And that's where it all fails. You can have, I think the top level is really important. Management really has to support it and do it, and the management may have to change some of the ways in which it does business. So it does have to come from the top down.
Well, and also the role of the consultant changes. You know the old joke about the consultant is, a consultant is someone that you give your watch to so that they can tell you what time it is. Okay, and the role of the consultant isn't more of the expert out there imparting information to you. It's now evolved into a cooperative role with the organization, a facilitator, a provider of expertise in how to interrelate all the different pieces.
Well, another part of that problem, and it's really important for top-level commitment, is that the consultant doesn't have all the technological answers anymore. There's no such thing as a single person that has it all. Consultants, in turn, rely on companies that they buy their products from. They rely on expertise from vendors that are out there. They may coordinate the software and hardware solutions from as many as 20 or 30 different companies in order to put together the best package to customize what they want. And I think that that's part of the thing that often is missing. I guess there's another piece regarding top-level commitment that's important. A lot of times managers feel that when they want to put on a whole new venture, that they can do so within the context of how they're currently operating. I have never ever found that to be a good way to do business. Even if you spread it out over 36 or 38 months to build a new technological change, top-level management has to set aside real time for people to be involved in part of this whole change process and in charge of the planning.
And you've got an excellent point there. Technology is not the complete answer here. We're not asking people to hire you and say, okay, what software or hardware do I buy to solve this problem? It's a software and hardware issue, possibly, yes, but it is also a management issue. A lot of times we go into places and they say, you know, we want to be able to do this, and you try and find the hardware and software to do that, and they can't do it, so you have to end up customizing something to do it. If you had gone in there and said, well, can you change the way you do business, you know, and then we can use this piece of software. A lot of companies just say, no, we can't change the way we do business, and you say, why? They say, well, this is the way we've always done it. Well, that's not an excuse anymore, because you can change the way you do business. You know, you can break that mindset that this is the only way to do it. It's really a marriage between the hardware, the software, and the management of that organization that's going to make any needs assessment successful.
If the only advice you get is the advice from the top manager on what the needs are, I don't think
you're dead.
Well, yeah, you are, because no one person knows, and not in today's society where there's so many different outside pressures that are impacting in any kind of business, or for that matter in education. And you just can't do it all by yourself anymore. It means that people have to be involved in assessing what are the needs. The other part about that, Barry, is letting those same people establish with you the priority of needs.
Well, now the priority, I can see the upper level people having a little bit more say-so over. But actually understanding the problem is where you get all levels of the organization in, because there's a lot of connections between offices and between buildings and between vendors that you really need to get an understanding of in order to get a comprehensive and working solution in place. But the priority has got to also take into account the mission, the goals and objectives of that organization.
What about resources? How can you take these needs and translate these needs in such a way so that you'll know that you're going to have the level of people, the level of time, the level of dollars, hardware and software, that it's really going to be essential to make this all work? Because adequacy of resources is really one of the most serious problems in making any kind of technology work.
Well, you know the old adage that I can do anything if given enough time and money. You know, I can put on any system, I can do anything if I just had those 2 points. A lot of companies today do not have the correct amount of time to do something, do not have the right amount of resources to do something. And people have to be very creative about how they do something. They cannot do it a lot of times in the traditional manner, where you go out and build a system to solve a problem, or go out there and buy something. You may have to reuse what you have. You may have to do it in steps, incremental steps, to get something online. You can't go out there these days and buy a comprehensive software package for $500,000 and another couple $100,000 for hardware and put it online. You may have to do it incrementally. You may have to phase it in.
I think in the viewpoint of most of our vendors, they feel basically the same way. It has to be a gradual, evolutionary process that you really have to take into consideration. The other thing is, I think really needs to be clarified in needs, is not everything should be automated.
Good point. You can't fit a square peg in a round hole, and some people still try to do that. There are some processes that you'll look at them and you'll say, okay, let's change this a little bit, and they'll say, well, wait a minute, I saw this great software that does this, that, or the other.
Right.
You know, but the key question is, are you going to come out of this being more effective or more efficient, and a more streamlined operation? And if the answer is no, then why are we spending the money and the time and the effort to go in and try and change it? Are we changing it just to change it? Are we changing it just to throw a computer in there? Or are we changing it to make it better?
You know, Barry, the overriding theme of this course is to increase productivity through technology and through automation. That has to be also the key to how you assess needs. You can have all the needs in the world, but if as you address those needs and you establish your priority among them, that they're not aimed toward increasing productivity, then it's really not going to work very effectively. And we've got to convince people that resources doesn't necessarily mean money. Even if you had all the money in the world to buy all the computers that you want and bring on all the new software, it doesn't mean that your operation is going to change. You've got to build that whole other management piece, the infrastructure, and all the other pieces that you have to put together with the people, with what you currently have, in order to make this whole mix work correctly.
One needs assessment that we had that failed was exactly what you said. It didn't involve computers. It didn't involve technology. It involved time. It involved people. There was not a major investment in defining the problem to come up with a solution. And they put a couple of people on it that didn't really know the complete operation. And every time you tried to meet with them, they said, oh, we're too busy, we're involved in this, we're involved in that. So it didn't have the top level commitment. You didn't have, you know, a commitment to solve the problem. And so you really didn't have the human resources available to actually address the problem and solve it. So that was where that one failed.
Barry, in pulling this thing together, I would like to say that one of the most difficult questions that I've found any manager to face is the question, what do you expect as a result of what's going to happen in this organization, given this set of needs? What do you want out of it? Can you be very specific? How do you see what you're doing done better or measurably better? And people have a lot of problem with that question, because all of a sudden they're saying, well, I've got these needs and I want to do it faster and I want to make more money, and that's sort of what it's about. And so what I try to do is always refer them back to their objectives and their mission and their goals. What final recommendation would you make in the area of helping them to achieve their final results?
I think you have to take everything we've talked about into consideration. And it's not just one thing that we've talked about. It's really a combination of everything: the organization, the culture, the technology, the missions and goals, top-level commitment, etc. All those things need to be taken into consideration when you do your needs assessment. If you take those into consideration, I think you will be successful.
You know, Barry, what we tried to concentrate on here was a set of principles rather than a set of steps, because there are hundreds and hundreds of steps that are recommended to do needs assessments. We feel that these principles, if properly applied, will make a very important difference in how the students put together their strategic management planning. We're going to talk about that a little later in the show and go over some general principles again that will give them another slant of this. But these principles are really important if you're going to be successful, no matter what the installation or operation. In the second part of today's session, we're going to be looking at an operational model that was in fact very successful. It was carried out in Fairfax County Public Schools. Barry Prokop and I spent the better part of 2 years putting together a plan of action and seeing that much of it was implemented within the schools. Barry is going to tell you a little bit about it, but before we get started in that, Barry, there were a number of conditions that we both felt were important and contributed to the success of what we did there.
Well, no, I wouldn't call them conditions, more like requests.
A request. Okay, well, should we give them the history of how these requests came about?
Please, go ahead.
Well, when we started this whole process, I was a consultant to the process, brought in by the manager at that time in Fairfax and the Department of Personnel Services. And I said that the first thing that one had to do was to sit down and to interview everybody in the organization and to develop a statement of needs. And unless that could be done properly, I really didn't see much success in what they really wanted to do. And he gave me at that time a complete list of what he said the needs were. And he knew some of the problem areas, but he was also new and did the best job he could to sort of outline what needed to be done. I said to him, well, if we're going to do this process, I would like to speak to everyone in the organization. And he said, well, I don't know if that's possible or not, but I will assign you to the person that I believe can really make a difference in helping you get to these people and also has a good understanding of technology. And you were the person that was assigned to work cooperatively with me in this whole process. What you suggested immediately, and what I didn't think we had time for, was that to interview everybody within the entire organization if we could. Certainly all the people that would be operating and using the technology. What was the reason that you suggested everybody basically rather than just the top managers?
In our organization, there are a lot of different levels and functions at that time, and everybody had a little piece of knowledge about the functions that ran in that office. Secondly, first, you had to get their perspective on all the different problems or perceived problems that were in the organization. So we're only talking about 200 people. The other side of it was I felt that nobody really knew what was going on in terms of the actual study of the consultant strategy that you were looking at. And they needed your perspective on that. They needed to know that you were involved in the process and were involving them in the process. And I thought that that was critical to the success of it, that everybody worked pretty much in cooperation and as a group to meet common consensus to get to a solution.
Was it true that in some cases the people that you and I both talked to as we went through this process had never before been queried about their jobs and needs who were out there?
That's a pretty fair assessment. Generally, they filtered their opinion, or the opinions got filtered up through the organization. And what I wanted to do was to break that down so that everybody had equal access to the people that were making the decisions on the process, to make it so that everyone had input into the process, and give you their different perspectives on the different problems. And there were a number of different problems in the organization, as you saw, and not really problems, but inefficiencies in the system. And everyone had their own investment or their own little piece of that problem. And as we found out, some of the problems actually went across office boundaries.
Right.
Some of them went across even the whole department. And so it was very beneficial, I think, to get everybody's perspective on that. Now, I know that in a lot of cases that's not really practical in larger organizations, to interview thousands and thousands of people. But in this particular case, everyone, I think, had their own little investment in the product.
I think if I had to do it now, I would use Delphi-based software where we could get consensus with people sitting at computers at various levels and having them all participate in a series of iterations to see what those problems were. But one of the things that I noticed was that as we did the interviewing on the problems, that even though we had the same topic problem, like improving a structure or format of a chart, that there were as many different opinions on that, what that problem was related to that, as there were people. And in some cases, people had more than one opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And what I saw evolving out of that, and what I didn't see initially, was that getting consensus on the problems really led to really crystallizing the needs. And I know that eventually we developed a problem-solution model, and I always felt that that was really a good way to get at the needs very precisely. But I was also very interested to find out that as we moved over a period of a year and a half, as we assessed problems and needs, and moved toward their solution and actually began to implement solutions, that the description of the problems, that is the consensus, decreased, and we got a much better sense of what those problems were as we went through.
Well, remember when we first started, no one wanted to talk to you.
I remember that.
But it wasn't just you. It was their perception of consultants. Consultants were there to form their own opinions and to reorganize or change their lives in some mean and drastic way. What you came in and did was basically offered them a partnership. You went in and said, I want to work with you. I am interested in your problems, and I want to solve those problems. And you did that at all levels of the organization. You just didn't talk to the directors. You just didn't talk to the coordinators. You just didn't talk to the office managers. You talked to all the different people to get their perspective on the problems. One of the things that the top-level managers told you when you came in that you may want to mention is how you were supposed to form your solutions. We didn't want this to be a book or a report that went on the shelf. The manager told you, and if I may quote him on this, that we don't have any money, or we have little money.
Yeah, he said, it was Ed Carr, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he said, we have almost no resources,
Mm-hmm.
and we would like you to write all of the solutions to the problems that you come up with in ordinary and plain English.
Mm-hmm. And they must work.
I remember that, and I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, that means don't give me a solution to a problem that you will not guarantee me that if we put any resources into it all, will not work. It has to work.
And it has to work in this environment.
And has to work in the environment.
I mean, don't tell me I have to buy a Cray computer, and set it over there to be able to run these calculations, because I can't afford a Cray. I can't afford the resources to run a Cray. So any solution you provide me has to work in this environment, which I thought was a very interesting approach.
Well, it created a lot of undue stress in my life for a long period of time. But to be frank with you, what came out of that for me was a whole new way of thinking. And I think before that time, I always had a very sophisticated technological solution to meeting needs. And incidentally, I felt they were good then and they're good now, but some of them didn't quite work because they were not as realistic as they needed to be. And they didn't always work within the practicality of the culture of the environment that I was in. And so I think what Carr did, which was very helpful, is he gave me a different sense of what your organization needed. And because of it, I felt that you and I both did a better job. But I remember that for every problem and solution that we came up with, it really was a long period of time before we could work it out. Also, getting rid of the technology language in order to solve technological problems was also a difficult thing.
Well, the first point you mentioned, reaching problems and needs had to have consensus at all levels. That was the most difficult part of the process. It wasn't in actually coming up with a problem. because after a while, everyone told you what the problems were. You remember at first, no one really wanted to talk to you, and then,
I remember.
well, hey, we had a couple of successes, and then all of a sudden everyone wanted to talk to you. So getting the problems wasn't really, a roadblock, but everyone had their own perceptions of how to solve that problem.
And so the consensus on solutions, which I agree with you, took much longer than it has ever taken in any kind of consulting work I've ever done, really was the most successful because everybody had a copy of that solution.
Well, even more successful than just the solution itself was we finally got to a point where everyone understood what everyone else did that related to that problem and solution. And that, when you have an organization that's very compartmentalized, after a while, historically, they get to only know their own piece of the organization. And I think what we did was help to break down some of those barriers, because with especially the problems that spanned over different sections and offices, now they had to say, wait a minute, that won't work because it impacts me because I do this. And wait a minute, that isn't going to work exactly right either, because once it comes from you, I have to do this with that. And so it really gave a sense of they all had to work cooperatively together to find a common solution.
One of the things I liked about the problem solution model that we used was that people continued to make suggestions for solutions even as some of the solutions were being put online. So there was a constant input into the problem solution model that we had for each of the problem areas. Mm-hmm. And so it was open the whole time. It took a little more to get it to that point, but I also feel that's why it was successful. What about the consultant and key developer role in terms of how we collected information? How successful was that as you look back on it?
One of the hardest parts, I would think, coming into an organization, and you can verify this since you were the consultant and I was the key developer on that project, was in some of the points that we talked about earlier, knowing the organization, knowing the culture of the organization. As a key developer, I already had a sense of all that. I knew what the organization was like. I knew what the culture was like. I knew what the technological readiness of the organization was like. I knew exactly where all the fires were, although I didn't know exactly what was fueling those fires.
Right.
And that was more of my support role, was to work with you to have you understand those parts of the problems. And when you proposed solutions to those problems, have you understand why they would or wouldn't work in our organization.
We took a long time to do this. One of the suggestions you made very early in the game, which I felt was important, was to get to know the people by name, so that when I walked into an office, I would know what they were about. And later on, as we prepared the problem solution model, which we're going to show them in a couple of minutes, that we knew in every case when we walked into an office exactly what we were going to talk about. So there was a sense of confidence that what we would talk about would be the problem that they'd helped to shape and the solution that they had helped to shape. I guess I was surprised by the fact that we didn't use quite as much technology to solve some pretty important problems.
Well, what was interesting is when we would look at some of the problems, it turned out that they were more, let's change the way we do business solutions than technology problems. And I think some people going in said, here's the computer person, and they're going to go throw some computers and some hardware and some software at us, and then walk away, and we're going to be stuck with, all this stuff on our desk, and we're going to have to learn how to use it. And I think that they were really excited to learn that it isn't that simple. And what I mean by that is that there are some things, some immediate results, just by changing the way you do business, that could have more of an impact than just providing the technology solutions.
There's one of the problems that we're going to mention in just a couple of minutes in our problem solution strategy, in which we had very advanced technology, but we didn't use it. Could we now, Barry, take some time and talk about the problem-solution problem and walk us through the steps, if you will, and how about a couple case studies so you can give us an example of what did work?
Okay. Let's go and talk about the actual process itself.
Okay.
The first thing you do in the organization is what we talked about. Get in and first get a feeling for the organization. And you did that with the key developer, myself, so that you can get up to speed quickly on what the organization is about, where the key areas of focus are, what you have to look at, where are the sand traps and where are the mountains of that organization, what to avoid, addressing, and what really to go in and attack. And we pulled out specific problems out of the organization, and the first thing we did was develop a problem statement, and that is the first part. It's assess the department problems.
As we did that, didn't we also put those problems together like building blocks so that we could relate similar problems not only within certain areas of the organization but across the organization as a whole?
Yeah, we basically broke it down by levels, and we'll get into that a little bit in a couple of minutes here. But you're exactly right. We isolated ones that were just within an office and then had a little bit broader scope and a little bit broader scope. Okay. So we'll be basically figuring out where those fit or where these blocks fit in that leveling process in a minute. Okay. But after we developed the problem statement, we had to reach consensus on the problem. And remember, in every step of the process, we're involving different members of the organization in that process. Right. So when we developed the problem, we just didn't run off into a corner and say, okay, here's the problem. Okay, now let's find a solution with it. We constantly went back to the people, back to the different people in the organization and said, is this the problem? Is this really the problem? Is this the problem? And got consensus on exactly what the problem was. And we had to rewrite that and rewrite that and rewrite that a lot of times so that, one, it was understood. Because remember the top management's requests, they had to be in non-technical language. You can't just throw a bunch of acronyms out there and long words and have everyone sit there and go, yeah, I think that's what I meant. Or have these complex diagrams out there with all these arrows and boxes and everyone not figure out exactly what you were talking about.
That's right. So
they had to be in simple language that the people in that organization could understand and could relate to. So once we had consensus, we moved to the next step, which was apply the evaluation criteria. Mm-hmm. And in that we had to evaluate lots of different alternatives. And you'll remember we came up with one problem and applied a solution to it and then went back to the people and I said, no, that won't work. And we went back and applied another solution. Sometimes we picked solutions that we thought would work and they knew wouldn't work, and other times we picked solutions, maybe the second level solution, the one that we thought wasn't as good, but they really took to and understood and would really, I think, make them almost as productive.
I guess the thing that surprised me is we started out with a problem solution book that probably ran a couple hundred pages, and by the time we were all done, we came up with maybe about 35 actual pages, and yet they're the ones that really worked. Because it was a constant problem, a process of refining and the problems and solutions.
Well, a lot of times we also came up with symptoms instead of the actual problems.
That's true.
And we figured out early on in the game, here are some symptoms, but wait a minute, here's the problem. If we solve this problem, then those symptoms will go away.
Right.
And so we focused in on the problem and not on the symptoms of that problem, and that's how we developed the solutions based on that problem. So we applied the evaluation criteria, still involving members of the throughout the organization, all levels of the organization, to get their opinions. Is this going to work? Is this going to solve this problem? Right. What problems do you see in implementing this? And really got their input and really decided, okay, yeah, that's valid. No, that's not. Yes, that will work. Okay, I understand exactly where you're coming from. Etc. The next was to determine a priority. And this really involved more of the upper level people in the organization. Basically, exactly where as it relates to your mission statement, your goals, objectives, etc. Where exactly do you want this placed in terms of priority? Remember, you said we came up with about 30 different problems in the organization, and we really had to keep going back to this because we just started cranking out problems and solutions in the organization, and that priority changed weekly. So whatever was a priority 5 yesterday was a priority 3 and a priority 7, depending on what new problems and solutions crept up.
This process really took into consideration the dynamic way in which organizations change.
Well, in 1 or 2 cases, the technology changed, or the culture changed, or the political atmosphere changed, so we had to go back and redo a problem and solution. Because what was true before wasn't true anymore. And that's one of the I guess, the critical components of this thing that we've probably should stress a little bit more, and I think we have been stressing throughout the whole SMP process, is you don't generate a document and say, here it is, it's done. It's never done. You're always going back and re-evaluating what you've done, because the most volatile things out there we used to think were the technology, but really in an organization, it's the culture and the politics and the relationships that you have throughout the organization, and the duties and responsibilities, the way government and state changes the regulations and policies, etc., that you really need to be constantly aware of on how they change that needs assessment that you've done.
Well, I know that one of the things we did also was to determine where in the organization the problem and solution would fit, if it was a baseline level or a second level or upper level, or would go across the organization as a whole. And I know that there are other pieces that we want to look at in the case studies when we do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things was determining the level of it, and we'll go over exactly what those levels are after we've gone through the whole model.
Okay.
But suffice it to say for the moment that we had to determine what level that fit in the organization. And that really affected the priority of it, because something that was isolated in one office didn't have as high a priority, unless it was a real critical function in that office, as something that affected the whole organization and was really pulling it down. And the higher level problems tended to get addressed first, unless it was a really hot topic in a level 1, which is the inner office problems.
Okay.
But then we had the next step in the process was we had to schedule the solution. When can we fit this in? When are we going to be able to devote resources? When are we going to be able to devote, if we have any, and resources could be anything, people, money, equipment, whatever. So we had to figure out a schedule of when we could implement all these different changes, and really nail some people down on exactly when we're going to be able to implement these, what resources were available, etc.
Could we take one of the case studies and walk them through it now?
All right. One of the ones that we did was currently before we had manual history cards. Okay. And every transaction that was done in the building, we wrote the actual transaction on there. So we had a history of all the different transactions in the building.
You mean in writing in some cases, handwriting?
Oh, definitely handwriting.
Okay.
They weren't typed. They were different colors of ink and different styles of handwriting, etc. And we just added cards upon cards depending on how long you were in the organization.
Weren't there a couple 100,000 of those cards?
A couple 100,000 of those cards. And in some cases, an individual had 10, 15 cards. And the problem was, how do you go back and look at this information effectively? Now, at that same time, we were implementing an automated salary history function that would feed right off of our personnel payroll system. Now, the problem was, what do we do with all these old cards? Do we put them into the system? Do we backload them into the system so they'd be online? Do we just not do anything with them? Do we put them on microfiche? Do we put them on CD-ROM, etc.? So we had to come up with a problem, and that was essentially the problem. Then we had to come up with a solution, and it took a while to come to consensus on the problem, and it took a while to come to consensus on the solution. The solution we picked we went back to the people with, and they felt uncomfortable with the solution. They said, well, you know, for one reason or another, I don't think that this is going to work. We went back, redid the solution, went back to them again, and they said, okay, yeah, I like this solution. It will work. It's within our budget. It's within our means. We understand it. We can use it. We already have this type of technology available, so let's go ahead. The next step was we determined the priority. At that time, it was a very high priority.
Yes.
So the upper level management put it right at the top of their priority list. Then this was a problem solution that we found based on our problem statement that affected all levels of the organization.
Didn't we suggest to them that they use CD-ROM for this information as a way to do it?
Mm-hmm.
But after we looked at all the pieces and the available technology and the cost factor, it seemed like a good intermediate step. Mm-hmm. And I believe one other person said, well, if we've got all the data down on a video or on a card or a photographic film, it doesn't really make any difference. We can always convert it later on to a CD-ROM if we need to.
Exactly. And this is what I was talking about earlier, about taking the incremental steps rather than the giant leap at the beginning. And they felt more comfortable going to that incremental step and then going forward from that point when they felt a little bit more comfortable with the technology.
Where does that stand right now? Is that pretty well implemented now? I know it took a long time because of the tremendous volume of cards. Where is that?
It's implemented, it's completed, and it's up and running, and it's very successful. And I think one of the reasons it is successful was everyone agreed on the problem, and everyone agreed on the solution, and I think everyone had a part in that solution.
Yeah, I know there were a lot of people at the meeting when we finally made the decision on that. And I also know that you and I were quite opposed to doing it, but quite frankly, the fact that everybody did agree to it looks like it made it work pretty well, hasn't it? And there's go ahead.
Yeah, we wanted to take the giant leap to go right to CD-ROM and implement it at that point, but they already had the microfiche, they already had those technologies in place, and they thought it would be a better for them to take the small incremental step and then move forward on to CD-ROM some point in the future.
Barry, talk to summarize this in terms of how the levels were organized in order for them to really work successfully.
It's very simple. The levels, we had 3 levels in the organization. The first level was within an office, basically a very localized problem. The second level was it kind of leaked out from that office to maybe over to 1 or 2 other offices or functions in the organization. And the third level was it hit the whole Department of Personnel Services. Now, Greg Cook, who we're going to be hearing in the next segment, said, well, actually, there's a level 4. And I said, well, level 4? He said, yes, across
the whole state.
Across the whole state, or across the whole nation, or across the whole world. And that's a very appropriate statement to make, because as we get more globalized, we are going to have level 4s out there.
Barry, I really appreciate that perspective. I think it really helps us to get a sense of a problem and solution model for technology that really works. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the whole problem and issues of needs assessments from a perspective of a very large and comprehensive community college. And Greg Cook is going to be coming and talking to us about some of the experiences he has had.
I'll look forward to seeing that in the next segment, Reynolds. ED 230, Managing Computer Applications, Tape 2 of 2, GW Television.
At this time, we're going to present a case study from Tidewater Community College. We have with us Greg Cook from Tidewater, who's going to be talking about the college itself and the kinds of things that the institution is doing as it works toward the process of assembling its needs and moving into the future. Greg, we're really pleased to have you with us today, and of course my co-host Barry Prokop. Greg, could you tell us a little bit about Tidewater Community College and the kinds of things it does in terms of automation right now?
Well, Reynolds, we are a medium-sized community college, about 17,000 students distributed on 4 campuses. And in terms of technology, we are probably a little behind the times. We do have around 550 computers that are mainly in the academic labs for student access. We do have 250 roughly academic, rather administrative computers. Most of our work is still done though in terminal emulation, and there are actually still probably around 50 terminals that are used for administrative purposes.
Are all these tied to your 4381 mainframe?
Right. We are still entirely dependent on the mainframe, and because we are part of the Virginia State Network, which uses IBM mainframes, we have an IBM mainframe as well.
Mm-hmm. What about the student access to the computers? You have, say, 17,000 students, and you have about 550 computers. It seems like that the ratio is a relatively low ratio. Do your students have fairly good access given that number of computers?
What we have found is that money for computers has been short. The General Assembly of Virginia, recognizing this, has allocated special funding each year expressly for purchasing hardware, and that money usually goes directly to the academic division. So most of the computers are owned by the academic divisions and tend to be fairly specific to the subject matter taught in that division.
Greg, give us a little bit of perspective on how you evolved to this point. I know in my own case, we started out in a mainframe environment and kind of evolved into the microcomputer business. Is that pretty similar to what's happening at Tidewater?
That's exactly what's happening. The computers really now are used primarily by students. PCs are really just beginning to migrate into the administrative side, and we see them being used for things like word processing, but there really isn't any overall organized application of this technology. Again, all of our administrative computing is done on the mainframe, the student information system, all of the financial record keeping is all still done on mainframes, and the only times you will see PCs used for that is with a terminal emulation capability in there.
What kind of things are you working towards now as you look to the future in terms of your computing needs?
Well, probably the greatest interest has been in getting a front end for the mainframe, something that will make the information in the mainframe a lot easier to get access to. And we've looked at a few systems like that. They tend to be Unix-based and really make it a much more user-friendly environment. As it is now, for us to extract data from the mainframe, we really have to talk to our programmers to do that. It's just not something you can go in there and find out how many students are taking English in a given semester very easily.
It sounds like you've got a lot of competing technologies that are involved in your operation. We're similarly, I guess, strategically placed or technology placed, as we have to rely on our programmers for accessing information out of our mainframes, and then we've got our whole PC environment over here where we're trying to make that work with the different applications that we have. Where do you see yourself going down the road here?
Well, one of the problems that we have that actually didn't used to be a problem was that Virginia is one of the few states in the nation that organized all of their community colleges on one statewide computer network. We've got 4 regional mainframes that support all of the colleges throughout the state, and there are 23 colleges. So our mainframe supports 3 other colleges in addition to ourselves. That, when it was originally put together, was a great advantage because it allowed the whole state to share resources in terms of programming. The only programmers we actually have at our college are actually statewide positions that belong to the network, and they are all basically mainframe programmers, COBOL and whatnot. What we would like to do is to grow in the direction of having that same sort of support in terms of PCs, so we can have a lot of locally originated programming. This is something that's being studied statewide, so we have to kind of fall into place with what will be decided in Richmond. But that's really one of the most important things for us right now, is getting some talent on the college for PC programming.
Will you be using any of the advanced productivity tools such as Visual C++, Visual Pascal, Visual Basic as productivity tools when you move into this environment?
We are looking at packages like that. Unfortunately, again, we're talking about programmers who basically have been doing COBOL all their lives, and we're not really sure if we're going to be able to get more positions or look into retraining the positions we have. And again, since these positions technically belong to the network, it's tough for us to just go in there and tell them that we want them to start doing some Visual Basic. So again, this is being looked at statewide, and perhaps what will come is a model that is based on the way the mainframe environment was, in that we will share PC support and programming statewide, but this is a conjecture at this point.
You've got to basically coordinate then, not just within your own community college, but also across the state with other organizations?
Actually, the coordination comes from Richmond, but that is in case that's the fact, because we really have to make sure that the smaller colleges are supported. When a need is identified at a certain college, let's say the continuing ed department may need a new tracking program at a certain college up in the mountains. Well, that programming request will get sent to Richmond, and then Richmond will distribute it to wherever the resources are available at the time. So we do have to coordinate across the state, but again, most of that is done in Richmond.
How do you address the evolution of technology? How do you make things happen? How did you get these, the PCs and the networks online that you have now, and move forward?
Well, I think this is a classic case of the technology happening without any planning. And what happened through the years was that the trust fund that did provide us, that's the special fund that the General Assembly provided, the money was spent on computers, but since the money is tied to hardware, there was never really any allocation for personnel support or really any planning. And really this year is probably the first year that we are starting to take, really to step back and to take an overall look at where we are going. The trust fund is a bit of a mixed blessing. It allowed us to get the hardware, but it also became very fragmented with it ending up in each of the divisions, so there's really no overall plan.
Are you going to change all that?
Well, I certainly won't, but we certainly have some committees looking into that. One of the advantages we have, and this may not be an advantage, but we have our 10-year study for accreditation comes up. We're a member of the Southern Association of Colleges, and every 10 years colleges have to do a self-study to remain accredited. And the association is allowing us to concentrate on collaborative technologies. Normally self-studies take an overall look at the whole institution in depth. They are trying a pilot program with us which will allow us to concentrate on technologies very intensively and not look quite as deeply into some other parts of the institution. So this is really forcing us to form the committees college-wide that will lead to studying the information that we really need to have.
And integrating all those technologies? And
that is certainly what we'd like to see as the outcome. But at this point in the process, the idea of integration is really something that's a bit of a dream, and I think that would certainly be something we would desire as an outcome.
Would that go into your final strategic management plan then?
Yes. We started a strategic plan last year, and the first outcome of that has been some strategic initiatives that basically involve specific areas where we need to spend some money right away. And they include such things as the front end for the mainframe, electronic classrooms, and similar technologies that would address areas that we really haven't looked at yet. Again, really the technology that we have achieved so far has mainly ended up in just computer labs for students, and we really haven't addressed the idea of using technology in the classroom, and certain things out of the strategic plan that we have come out with so far will address that.
Let's talk for a second about the use of this whole system for the administration of and functions of the community college. What kinds of functions are being supported by the same mainframe and same configuration here?
Well, on the mainframe we have a The main package is called the SIS, which is the Student Information System. That has all of our student data on there. The other big application on there is for our accounting, and again, that is all really set up for Richmond so that they can basically keep an eye on what we're doing with finances. The SIS, though, is really what drives all the information in the college right now, and that is probably the key program that we really need to break out of the mainframe so that counseling, financial aid, and other administrative areas can really get access to this information in a timely fashion, and also so they can work with it in terms of modeling and seeing trends and other similar analysis.
When you are going through all these studies, what do you think are the most important outcomes? You mentioned before the integration of the different environments, and also the getting the information off of the mainframe in terms of the student information areas. What other areas or goals do you have down the road?
Well, there are a few things that we have coming down that will be affecting our strategic planning. One is a statewide initiative for library automation. The General Assembly and the VCCS have asked that the community college system network all of the libraries so that we can again share those resources. And along with that, some of the smaller towns that do not have automated library systems will also be able to use this system. Our campus, or rather our college, has been identified as one of the pilot colleges for that project. And that is helping us in a way because that's forcing us to install lands in the libraries which will allow at least an automated library situation, but also through that we can through using gateways, give access to the internet and other facilities for doing research. Probably another big goal that we would have would be just to get the campuses alone to where they each had a distinct LAN. We have small LANs on the campuses that comprise really just individual academic labs, but we really do not have any campus-wide LANs yet. Once we really are in the process of establishing those, and once we get those put together, we would like to see, of course, a wide area, which is necessary in our part of the country there because our campuses are about 30 miles apart. I mentioned the internet. There's been much interest by the faculty and the students in having access to the internet. And this is probably the biggest goal that we have coming that is faculty driven. They really want to be able to get into that for research and also as a teaching tool for both themselves and for the students. I think if it's the kind of thing that I think if they actually see what getting onto the internet is like, they may not be so excited about it, but that will probably create a new demand right there, and that is front-ending the internet. And this gets back to, again, having access to local programming resources so that we can take care of these types of problems within the college without having to depend on the state as a whole.
Sounds like one of your underlying goals here, you talked about front-ending the IBM, you talked about front-ending the internet. Sounds like one of the goals that you're looking towards is to actually make this as seamless as possible for all the end users so they don't really have a painful experience getting information out of the IBM or a painful experience getting information out of the internet or other local area networks. Am I on target with that?
Exactly. I'd say probably one of the greatest problems we have, and I think you addressed it earlier in the show, is really the psychological aspect of the technologies that we are facing. It's one thing to get the hardware in place, and we've had enough trouble doing that, but I think we really have a real problem in getting the faculty and staff used to having these resources. And probably the easiest way to deal with that issue is to make the hardware and the software basically transparent. Really, that's my goal, is to make it as easy to use as a television. If we can't have it...
I'm glad you said television instead of VCR, because I still can't figure out my VCR.
Yeah, well, if the technology isn't on that level, if people just can't sit down in front of it and use it without thinking about what they're doing and how they're getting there, I think we're always going to have a problem. And again, this all comes back to having the PC programming, because I think what we have found is that the commercial, what's commercially available generally doesn't quite fit. There's a lot out there that you can use for certain areas, but we seem to be seeing a great need for a lot of customization.
Well, I think that you've hit on a key point there. No one's going to use something that's hard to use. And if you've got a number of diverse environments out there, which it seems like you have, you've got standalone PCs, networked PCs, IBM mainframe, and now this whole communication parameter built in there. If people don't perceive it as easy to use or readily available, they're not going to be out there using it.
That's right.
As you look at all the needs you seem to be satisfying, did those needs emerge over a period of time, or did they come from this computer committee that's put together? Did they come from the state? Did they come from the students? How did they emerge through the system so that you really knew precisely what it is you wanted to do and to move toward this future?
Well, to be honest, we don't have a real handle on that, and that's part of really what the process has been for us recently, and that is assessing the needs and finding out if the needs are really there that we are hearing about. One of the interesting things that we found when we first looked into this was that there was a list of programming requests for our mainframe programming department. Really, it was a waiting list of about 143 some odd requests. And these were everything from major programming requests that would create whole new databases to simple things like adding a field to a given registration screen.
You're not alone. There are a lot of companies out there that have that same kind of list.
Yeah. And I think one of the first things you have to do is really look at that list. And if you don't have a handle on whether or not each of those little requests really fits into the big picture, you may be going down a road that is going to really lead nowhere. That's really been the first thing, though, is to looking at what was in the loop for the mainframe. I think a lot of the other requests, though, really come from people who see the technology in other settings. And that's one of the aspects of higher education. Of course, there's a lot of networking and people going to conferences. And because of that, we get a lot of people coming back saying, well, gosh, I saw this at such and such a college. Why can't we do that? And again, this leads to a whole another round of assessment. We have to look at that and go, well, can we do it? Do we really need to do it? And how would we do it if we do need to do it?
It sounds like establishing a priority of needs at your school is a fairly complex process.
Right, and I think that's really where we're at right now. That's what we see as being the first step.
So establishing this priority, if I can sort of sort through what we've been talking about, is you have a limited amount of resources. You have several committees that have been providing information to help to establish those needs. You have outside people who constantly go to conferences and who can tell you how those needs need to be shaped, at least in their mind. And then, of course, you have state requirements as well that also help you to shape it. So
well, and also integration with all the other agencies and state and whatever that are out there. And you've got to take those needs into consideration also, because you're competing with them, aren't you?
That's right, and that gets back to the fourth level that you mentioned earlier. Again, Virginia is a little unique in this, that we do have the statewide network. And I do want to stress that that was and probably continues to be a big advantage. But with downsizing, when you're dealing with a whole state system based on mainframes, the idea of even front-ending, let alone going to PC-based management, is a massive undertaking.
Well, and I think it gets back to what we talked about in earlier sessions, Reynolds, that this is an evolutionary process. I don't think Tidewater is going to be able to do this overnight, nor is any other community college or higher ed or schools. You know, they're going to have to evolve into this kind of a setting.
looks like it's going to take several years in order to make this work, even after the needs and priorities really become very clear. And it's also going to have to be continually shaped by the certain restrictions that are being placed on by the state and new information that's coming to the field. You know, one of the problems with the evolutionary process, of course, is the dynamic and changing nature of technology. And at the same time, you're trying to put forth a plan that is realistic and practical and takes all these things into consideration. You also have the looming changes of technology which are coming in all the time. And
trying to hit a moving target is what you're...
Well, sometimes in some organizations, they have to order equipment considerably in advance because it's a long and involved process that way as well. Mm-hmm. And they may be ordering computers now that will be out of date almost a day after they buy them, and new technology will be coming online. Am I creating problems that don't exist, or do you face those problems as well?
No, I think that was touched on earlier in the show too, when you were talking about really consultants not being an expert in a given area, that they have to, they too can't really keep up. And I think what we are seeing is that this places a lot of stress on the needs. Mm-hmm. If you focus on the needs, when the time comes, you'll have to take whatever hardware is there for it. And as soon as you start looking at the hardware that's available, it's an endless enigma, because you start planning on using hardware that's out there now, and by the time you do get it, it's not going to fit what you're doing, or else there's going to be something better that everybody will scream at you that we should have. And it's particularly a problem dealing with the state, because we do have a fairly convoluted purchasing process. So it does take us a while to purchase equipment. In fact, a small case study of that, we recently purchased multimedia labs for interactive video training. And it took us literally about a year and a half to get this purchase through Richmond. Because it was off the state contract. The state has most things that you can think of on a given contract list. And if something that you want isn't on the contract, then things can get pretty complicated to justify it and purchase the gear that you need.
Well, we bought a couple things, and by the time they got through purchasing, they didn't make them anymore. So
that's not uncommon.
You know, in a way, though, that's just what this whole dynamic nature of technology is all about. You sort of make the best guess you can. Mm-hmm. And
but I think that Greg's exactly right. As long as you focus on the needs, you know exactly what you want, and then it's a matter of trying to get the technology to fit that. And whether it's your current technology, and I've got my need, how can I satisfy with this current technology, while in the back of my mind keep trying to upgrade that that technology to get better and better or be more responsive to fill that need.
So need contracts and specifications need to be very clearly defined. I think that's what we're saying. Have you made good progress being able to coordinate all of the groups and people that have made input into the establishment of your needs? Are you getting better at being able to do that, or does changing conditions in society and everything else make it more complex?
Well, there's a couple of dynamics at work at our institution, and probably the key dynamic is dealing with a multi-campus institution. Over the years, they really did tend to become separate fiefdoms. And really, when you're planning for technology like we're talking about, you have to look at it college-wide, particularly in times of budgetary stress, which we are presently in. And I think when you talk about bringing people together in committees and this type of planning, probably the most difficult thing for us is to keep people focused on the college-wide solutions, which we are not being successful at, and we don't have the answer for that as of yet. Obviously, there are always some people who are looking to college-wide solutions, but the people at the campuses, and probably rightly so, tend to be fairly aggressive at protecting their own interests, and that's really probably the key problem.
Of course, nobody else shares that problem.
No, I don't think so. Not one I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of people out there try and protect their own interests, and across an organization, even between departments, and it's really getting beyond that, which is the most difficult part. And we even got to the point in one organization where we had to post a sign up there that says, keep the organization in mind here, as you're trying to make a decision, because a lot of people just lose sight of that.
Part of the technology is also not contributing towards a very cloistered type of decision making, and that is that as we run into more and more of a seamless environment where small labs are connected to gateways, and gateways are connected to somebody else, or you have a library that shares resources with 10 or 12 other libraries, it's going to make it pretty difficult just for one person or one group to have access to the technology. This whole problem is forcing people to share, and one of the problems with large systems, it just takes a long period of time to be able to coordinate this constructively to make it work. And I'm sure that that's part of the problem in Virginia, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and even within our college, I think we have a lot of problems doing that. I think one of the things we're seeing is that making the organization really work with the technology. That is, we're dealing with an organization that was really based on doing things with paper and operating around the mainframe. The organization charts reflect that. Really, until last year, we had a fairly pyramid-shaped reporting structure in the college. One of the first things our president did when we started looking at this was to establish, he really reorganized the upper management structure to where we have it's more of a flat management structure, and that's really driving what it is we're trying to do with a lot of the other areas in technology, and that is when you look at the admissions and registration process, that's entirely driven by people filling out forms, standing in lines, information being entered into terminals. What we're finding is, as we look towards PC-based solutions for this, that is allowing counselors to register people directly from their PC. Solving the technical solution is only half of the problem, because it turns out the organizational structure isn't really designed to support that type of information. And So we are looking at reorganizing really the whole admissions and records process to take into account the new technologies that are available.
That's really great, because a lot of organizations try and automate a manual process where they just take what they had manually and then try and automate it. What you're doing is something differently. You're looking at the technologies out there and saying, you know, how can I fill this need, and then looking at the organization to figure out how you can organize around that solution. You know, a lot of companies aren't doing that.
What I like about what I'm hearing Greg is really doing is he's taken in a lot of the kinds of things that you should when you're really trying to plan successfully. It looks like he's taking all of the groups into consideration that he needs to take into consideration. State, local groups, the faculty who certainly are influential, the students, they're all part of the process. He's put together a dynamic plan. He maybe doesn't have it all together yet, but maybe that's okay in a sense, because maybe that's where this plan should be right now. There's no sense in outskating your resources, and that you seem to have that in hand as well.
Well, one of the things, if I may, Greg, one of the things you probably recognize is that there are some things you don't have control over. You know, how do you deal with those kinds of issues?
Well, these are questions I think that are really going to face not only what Greg is putting together, but just about everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
It looks to us, Greg, as if one could take some of the principles for success, and if we could take away your timetable, mm-hmm. and the resource allocations, it seems to me like you have a pretty good problem solution model that you have in line, and we think that you may not have total control of your needs assessment process, but it looks like you're getting pretty close to it.
We're getting there.
Yeah, well, that's maybe what it's all about.
Well, remember, Reynolds, we said this is a continuous process, and so his needs assessment is going to evolve over time, and probably, you know, he's still looking out in the future at that target, and he'll get there eventually.
Thank you very much, Greg and Barry. And in our next part today, what we're going to be talking about is what have we learned that we can apply to the whole process of strategic planning. In this last segment today, we're going to be looking across what we've talked about in the other sessions and discussing with you some of the principles that we've extracted from it. Barry and I thought that we would give you principles rather than steps because they could apply to so many different projects. And Barry, these seem relatively simple, but I've noticed in projects people don't always take these into consideration. Let's take the first one, the whole idea of taking the time to do a thorough job. And before we discuss this, I'd like to go back for a second to Greg Cook. I know Greg would have liked to move along a lot faster in his planning process. Mm-hmm. But quite frankly, he didn't have the luxury to be able to get everything done at once. It's a question of resources, question of statewide needs, a lot of other factors. But what about in the planning that you and I did, It took a couple years. And ordinarily, if we'd had all the resources together and everything that we wanted, we certainly could have done it in much less time. The question is, would it really have worked as well?
Well, there are really 2 points you're talking about here. One is, I think in both projects, they're really doing a thorough job. Greg is really taking into account his current environment. He's got a mainframe out there. He's got some PCs. He's got local area networks, and he's got a diverse area, geographic area, that he's trying to tie everything together. So I think in his case, it's going to take a little bit more time to do a thorough job than if you're in a more localized setting with fewer technologies to work with. So yes, some companies are going to be able to move faster than others. Some people are going to move more rapidly along doing their planning. But the point you made is, everyone has to do a thorough job. You have to understand all of the different problems that you have in an organization. And you have to be able to do that by talking to various levels and members of that organization. You can't just take one person's word for it. And thorough job is also resolving all the conflicts of the information that you get. You get a lot of different versions of who shot John and what went wrong and why a process isn't working or why a process is broken. And you need to sort through all that to come to the real problem that people are encountering.
One of the things that I'm sometimes told to do when I do consulting work is that you're allowed 30 days or 60 days to give us a statement of needs, and that's it. And at the end of that time frame, that's what we go with, whatever it happens to be. And I realize that no matter where you are, there are always deadlines and time frames. But if the time frame that is given to you is simply not sufficient to get consensus, to really talk to the people, to get a sense of the readiness of the organization that you're working on, to really understand what kind of resource allocation you can depend on when you do your purchasing, or the kind of people you need to make it all work, and also, quite frankly, the infrastructure that's involved, then your planning is not going to be very successful. So timing, taking the correct time to do the job as completely as you need to put the needs together, I feel is one of the most important and strategic principles that you can put into it.
Yeah, and one of the problems, excuse me, I've had with current methodologies is exactly what you said. You take the time up front, define the needs, and then you go through the rest of the process and never look back at those original needs or problems that you identified. And this happens time and time again, and one of the biggest problems we have is a lot of times that problem has changed.
Yeah.
The environment has changed. So I think doing a thorough job doesn't just mean, identifying the problem completely.
Right.
But it also means having that feedback mechanism to ensure yourself as you go through the process that nothing's changed to make your solution work.
So you sort of leave your need open as much as you can, so that as you move through this dynamic planning process and go to the other pieces, that you don't say, well, this was our need and we're just going to cut it off because this is what we had planned on. But you leave it open to input from the field and the changing nature of technology, and you take it into consideration so that you can take account of the changes that are going to occur.
Sometimes what happens is you define a need, and then you go through the planning process and define a solution. They implement the solution, and then you basically have addendums to try and fix the changing nature of that problem. And what people really need to do is, take that change into account as you're going through the process and not kind of tack it on at the end.
Maybe there are two parts to this, and it brings us really to our second point. You define your needs as precisely as you can, and you separate it if you possibly can separate it. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, you look at that as part of an integrated solution, because there might be 4 or 5 needs that at a level 1, like we talked about today, but as you move up and up, the need might be much more clearly defined as a single problem, a single solution. And that's really the case. So, and earlier we talked about the concept of needs as building blocks. In a very, very large organization similar to Fairfax, as you know, we had a lot of problem because we tried initially to define the needs so broadly that we couldn't come up with effective solutions. So what we decided to do was to isolate that need, to break it down into its, what I would call, lowest common denominator, being able to really pinpoint it. And then, based on that, we began to build it in the form of a whole configuration of needs, so that as we went across departments and divisions, as we went to the highest level that we could within the department, that it made sense and we could see how all those pieces fit.
No, I think that's exactly right. You need to think of it as building blocks, and you can take any block out and look at it individually or make it part of the whole. I don't think that you can make it, using your same analogy, like Lego, where you click them all together and you can't pull out any individual piece. So you need to be flexible enough to be able to take all of those factors and look at a problem separately and look at it as part of the integrated whole and judge its impact on the organization.
Yeah, the idea is to sort of is to say, okay, this is the best we can make this need within this current time frame, but there are 4 or 5 other needs that we can tie into that. And it could be that one of those needs changes, the other needs do not. Well, you've got a real advantage because you can see the stability of what you're doing.
Exactly.
It also makes prioritization a little bit easier too.
Well, let's get a little bit back to the building blocks.
All right.
When we go in and look at those building blocks, I think in order to have an effective building block, you need to get to our next point, which is talk to every person who influences the SMP side. You can't have a solid solution or a solid problem unless you take the people that are involved in that problem into consideration and look at all of the problem from all the different angles and its impact on other problems and solutions, et cetera, out there.
You know, Barry, I read a case study about a computer organization. He was using a lot of computers, and a new manager came in. And they were having a lot of problems in trying to get the whole organization to function as a whole for some of their problems. And one of the first things the new manager did was he reestablished groups that would provide input into the establishment of needs. And so they came and they had these groups already, and the manager said, "Excuse me, where's the custodial and janitorial staff?" And the people said, "For what?" And he said, "Well, don't we have a lot of problem in getting the paper into our organization and getting it through the system? Don't we have a lot of problem in how we coordinate the various new computers that come in and come out? This always has been a real problem with us. Maybe we could learn something from them." So he established in several of the committees places for the janitorial and support staff to come in. And what they really found as these people, as they began to talk, is that they could make some pretty good suggestions on how, within the context of their job, they could move equipment better, how they could move paper better, how they could handle the loading dock situation better. And it really improved the overall performance of the organization. So this idea of talking to every person in the organization that can influence the final plan, I think makes enormously good sense.
Well, and also leads us to the next point, which is to verify and support the SMP judgments with research. Once you've talked to all the people in an organization, you've got to basically verify what they've said is true, either by talking with other people or by documentation that's out there or by examining the process itself, so that you can really feel comfortable that you have a handle on the problem and maybe not the symptoms or the complete problem.
I've often heard it said in some of the organizations where I've worked that we really don't have time for research. Just sort of tell us what's out there and we'll deal with it from that perspective. Just give us your judgment. Or they'll get a group of people together who make that decision. And that's, quite frankly, a very dangerous thing to do, because of the changing technology. As you know, one of the things we do in this course to keep students up to date is every week we re-examine the research on any given one of our sessions. And for example, this last time we discovered there were about 8 or 9 articles that we wanted to put in the bibliography that no longer apply because the world has changed. So we're probably going to pull those out. I think in this particular case, you have to use all the research that you can get. And that research has to be, can come from databases like Dialog and from Mead Data Central, the ones we saw in an earlier show. They come from individuals who are experts in the field. And I think that that's the key here.
Well, and also individual experts within the organization.
Absolutely.
And also comparison with other organizations that are in the same field.
I saw a sign one time in an organization I was walking through, and it said on the sign, it was a big sign, it said, "Trust the judgment of the people you work with." I thought it was a good sign, and I never saw it before, but I think it relates specifically to the fact that if you hire people in an organization, then you have to trust their judgment. That judgment, wherever possible, can be verified by research, the research that they themselves will do, because people want to make the right judgments. And inevitably, they'll go back to their baseline research and go back to their disciplines.
Well, I think what we found in a lot of the work that we've done is people really want to do a good job.
Absolutely.
They really want to improve the process, and a lot of times they don't have the outlet available to be able to improve the process. And by doing these needs assessments, you really provide them the opportunity to say, hey, you know, here's a better way to do this.
Right.
And that kind of leads us to the next step. Once they've told us what the problem is, then we've got to reach consensus.
That's the key here, because if you want everybody to participate in the solution, then you need to get consensus on the needs to begin with.
Well, let's look at what Greg Cook was saying. He's got a lot of different campuses, he said, out there that have their own opinion. And all of them aren't going to move in the same direction unless that they can reach consensus on what that direction is going to be. And that's a key area for him, is to get that consensus so that they can move forward as one unified group towards a common solution.
Some time back, I worked for the Navajo Indians in Saline, New Mexico. It's an area called Four Corners. And one of the things the Navajos do is that before they make an important decision, they bring everyone in that's impacted by that decision, and they all get together and they discuss it. And it could take a tremendous amount of time. But once the decision is made, then what occurs is that they know that it can be implemented because they've already agreed to it. Mm-hmm. And the Navajo model, of course, is very difficult to utilize in perhaps this kind of environment, but the principle's the same.
Well, it's not. It's exactly it. You've got to reach consensus at all levels. You've got to bring the group of people that are affected by that decision together and say, listen, is this a good idea? Should we go forward with this? Will this work? And if they say yes, you've got all the players in the game right there that have agreed that this is going to work and that they're willing to implement it.
You know, also, Barry, there's a lot of really exciting new technology that's out there in terms of software that allows for this kind of consensus. I mentioned earlier today the Delphi process, and that Delphi process has been utilized through automation and through connectivity for a lot of times. And I think they're the kinds of new technologies that we can include even if we have a massive organization. So we certainly need to build that into the process as well. Let's talk about keeping the process open to every member of the organization. We've sort of touched on that, but let's talk about it now by saying that you have to have an open forum in what you're doing. You can't hide things. You can't keep it to one group of the organization if it's going to impact them, and if you expect later on for them to be actively involved in supporting what it is you're trying to develop.
Well, and I think by the same token, you can't gather everybody together in an organization in one big room and tell them what's going on. I think with the changing of the times here and the diversity of the work locations and the increases in the number of the employee population, you've got to try different methods out there. And the key here is keeping the communication lines open within the organization as you go through this process. And I think that's what you mean here by you say keeping the process open to every member of the organization. You've got either through email, through memos, through committee meetings, whatever avenue you decide, it's got to be an open and above board process and something that everyone knows about and can have input into.
And it has to be there all the time, doesn't it? Throughout the entire process. You just can't say, okay, geez, we're done now with phase one of what we're doing, or we really have established these needs at this point, and now we're going to go into phase two. It doesn't really happen like that. These processes, all the planning processes run in parallel with one another. And you could be establishing needs almost until a week before a 2-year project is done, because the needs for one particular building block or one particular piece may in fact continue to change or be impacted by new technology. And the way in which you keep it open as a planner makes sense. And you need to tell people even before you start your needs assessment process, look, throughout the entire process, one of the things we're going to do is keep this process open. And you're going to have an opportunity, whoever you are, to make input into this, to help to change it, to give us your ideas. Now, it doesn't mean because you give us your idea that the whole thing is going to change, but it does give you an opportunity to say, no, I don't think this will work any longer, and I don't think it's going to help our organization anymore. One of the real problems that I've noticed in organizations is what I call valuing the judgments and opinions of employees and staff. I saw a really interesting case study about a computer organization that made computer parts and that was failing. And they brought in a new manager, and one of the first things he said was, from this point on, your suggestions, your ideas are going to make a difference in how this organization functions. And what he did is, and every time somebody made a good suggestion, one that really contributed significantly to increasing productivity and production, he rewarded that person. Now, it wasn't a big reward, but he would call the entire organization together. It was a small factory, and he would say to them, you know, we're going to honor this person because this person really made a significant difference.
Well, I think what you're saying there is the feedback. People have to know that they're contributing, and you've got to be able to say, hey, you know, Reynolds, you know, that was a great idea. We're going to take that into account. Not so that when they give a suggestion, they feel like it's just dropped into a black hole somewhere, and that no one ever really listened to them, because after a while they're going to stop making suggestions.
I remember that when we were doing the Fairfax County project, that we were going down to see somebody. Somebody stopped us in the hallway and said, I've changed my mind on the solution, and I think it ought to be done this way. And I remember that you sat down right then and made a note on the page in order to change the solution. And then you immediately went back to your office and you made the change in order to make it work. Barry, it wasn't, in my judgment, as important that you simply made the change as that you showed that person that you valued what that person had to do. You then made the change, and you then rearranged the entire solution based on a very, very good suggestion on the part of the employee. That's what I call adding value, and I think throughout this whole thing, a really important planner needs to do that. I'm just going to quickly summarize. How do you establish your priority of needs? And I think there are certain factors that are out there. One of the factors is that it really does have to impact and affect productivity. If it occurs over and over again, you've got to take that into consideration. It has to be ready for solution, and it has to be something that you can manage. You have to be able to take the resources into consideration, and it really has to be able to respond adequately to the needs of the users?
Well, I think that's probably the most important point.
Okay.
It has to be able to respond to the users of the organization, the customers, the users, whoever the problem is trying to get at. You know, you're not going to be successful if the people out there that you're trying to serve aren't happy.
And if you don't really establish the priority of needs correctly up front, with clearly defined needs in the way in which we've been talking about them today, I don't think you're going to be very successful.
Well, I think that that's a key. I think you need to take all these factors into consideration as you develop your needs assessment, and you'll be successful.
Well, Barry, I think we've given him some pretty important principles today, and I hope that as people develop their strategic management plans, that they'll really be able to put all of these things together.
I'm sure they will.